Richard had always believed that moving into the Willow Creek subdivision would be the beginning of a new chapter in his life, a safe haven where his daughter Emily could grow up without fear. But little did he know that behind the manicured lawns and white fences lurked a monster who wore pearls and carried a clipboard, a woman named Margaret, though everyone whispered Karen under their breath whenever she strutted through the cul-de-sac with her self-righteous smirk and sharp tongue. The kind of neighbor who measured grass with a ruler and snapped pictures of garbage cans left out 2 minutes too long. Richard, being a lawyer, thought he could handle people like her with calm reason and airtight arguments, but he wasn't prepared for the venom she carried in her heart, especially toward Emily, his 10-year-old daughter, who had been born with cerebral palsy and required a wheelchair to move around, her fragile body, often a target for cruel stares and pity, but never outright hatred, at least until Margaret set her eyes on her. It all started subtly, the way these things always do, with passive-aggressive comments at HOA meetings like, perhaps certain families should consider whether this community is really suited for special needs, and icy smiles when Richard rolled Emily down the sidewalk. But soon the whispers grew sharper and the glances turned to glares, though Richard tried to dismiss them as the usual suburban gossip, the petty politics of people with too much time on their hands. Yet deep down he felt a chill every time Margaret's eyes lingered on Emily as though she were a stain on the perfect picture of their neighborhood. There were moments when Emily, innocent and pure-hearted, would ask him, "Daddy, why does Mrs. Margaret look at me like that?" And Richard, forcing a smile, would say, "She's just unhappy with her own life, sweetheart, nothing to do with you." Though inside his stomach knotted because he knew hatred when he saw it, and Margaret's hatred was simmering, waiting for an excuse to boil over. Then came the small incidents, like the morning when Emily's wheelchair left a faint track on the freshly poured sidewalk chalk her neighbor's kids had been drawing, and Margaret stormed across the lawn, shrieking, "Control your child. She's ruining the children's art." As if Emily, who had simply smiled at the colorful drawings, was some kind of vandal. Richard bit his tongue that day, wheeling Emily back home. But inside he burned with rage because he had seen the way Margaret's eyes gleamed, not with annoyance, but with something darker, a hunger to humiliate and crush. Still, he told himself he was overthinking it, that perhaps it was just neighborhood friction, but fate was already winding the spring tighter, setting the stage for something far more sinister. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops and the street lamps flickered on, Richard heard raised voices outside and stepped onto his porch to find Margaret arguing with an elderly neighbor about a lawn ornament, her voice shrill, cutting through the air like a knife, and for a moment her gaze drifted to Emily, who sat beside him in her wheelchair, holding her stuffed rabbit, and Richard swore he saw Margaret's lips curl into a smile, not the polite, forced smile of HOA politics, but the smile of a predator who had found her prey. That night, Richard lay awake replaying it in his mind, telling himself he was being paranoid. Yet when Emily had trouble sleeping and climbed into his bed whispering, "Daddy, I'm scared of her," he knew his instincts weren't wrong. The unease grew heavier when at the next HOA meeting, Margaret slammed her papers on the table and began ranting about unsightly wheelchairs left outside and liabilities on the community sidewalks. Her voice rising as several neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unwilling to speak up but too cowardly to stop her, and Richard sat there gripping his pen, so hard his knuckles turned white, fighting the urge to leap across the table. But instead he cleared his throat and said in his calm lawyer's voice, "My daughter has the same right to live here as anyone else, and I will not tolerate discrimination." And though the room went silent for a beat, Margaret's glare burned into him, and he knew in that instant that she would not let it go, that she would escalate until she got what she wanted. Walking home from that meeting under the dim glow of the streetlights, Richard felt a heaviness pressing down on him, an unshakable dread he couldn't rationalize away. And when Emily squeezed his hand and said, "Daddy, are we in trouble?" he forced a reassuring smile, but his heart screamed yes, because he had seen Margaret's eyes, and they were the eyes of someone who wasn't just annoyed or bitter, but dangerous, and though he didn't know when or how, he knew she was planning something, and that something would shatter their lives. Daniel had always considered himself a patient man, someone who could endure the slings and arrows of daily life without letting anger consume him, but Patricia, The neighbor everyone had quietly nicknamed the HOA Queen was testing limits he never thought he had, and her obsession with controlling everything around her was beginning to circle tighter and tighter around his daughter Sophia, whose fragile frame and wheelchair made her an easy target for someone looking to bully without consequence. The first serious incident came on a warm Saturday morning when Sophia begged her father to take her down to the little park at the end of the cul-de-sac, a simple outing Daniel always cherished because he loved watching the joy in her eyes as she listened to the birds and felt the sunlight on her cheeks. Yet, as he wheeled her down the sidewalk, Patricia appeared on her porch in her pressed blouse and oversized sunglasses, barking, "You can't let her scuff up the walkway with those. Wheels, Daniel, we've just had it power washed," as if Sophia were some kind of pollutant staining her perfect world. Daniel tried to ignore her, tried to keep his calm lawyer's demeanor, but Sophia's shoulders hunched and her little hands gripped the armrests of her chair, her eyes shimmering with the kind of shame no child should ever feel, and Daniel felt a flicker of rage in his chest, though he pushed it down, reminding himself not to give Patricia the satisfaction, but Patricia wasn't. Done. By the time they reached the park, she had marched after them, clutching her phone, snapping pictures of the wheelchair tracks in the dust like they were evidence of a crime, muttering loudly to no one in particular, "This is why our property values are plummeting." And though no neighbor dared to intervene, Daniel could see curtains twitching, eyes watching but lips sealed, and he realized in that moment that Patricia thrived not only on her cruelty, but also on the cowardice of those around her. Later that week, things escalated again when Daniel arrived home from work to find that someone had dumped a pile of garbage bags across his driveway, reeking of rotting food and flies, and when he confronted Patricia, who stood smugly watering her flowers just a few feet away, she shrugged and said, "Maybe if certain people respected community standards, they wouldn't attract trash," her voice dripping with insinuation, and though Daniel could have argued, could have threatened her with legal action, he chose instead to clear the bags in silence because Sophia was watching from the window, and he didn't want her to see how close her father was to losing control. But Patricia's cruelty wasn't confined to petty harassment. Soon it turned directly on Sophia herself, like the afternoon when Sophia was sketching in her notebook by the sidewalk and Patricia stormed over, pointing at the colored pencils scattered near the curb, shouting, "Pick those up. You're making the neighborhood look like a junkyard." Her voice so sharp that Sophia froze, tears filling her eyes as she whispered, "I'm sorry," and tried to gather the pencils with trembling hands while Patricia loomed above her, sneering, "Maybe if you didn't need that chair, you wouldn't be such a burden." Words so venomous that Daniel, who had just stepped outside, felt his knees go weak with shock. He rushed to his daughter's side, his hands shaking as he collected the pencils for her, glaring up at Patricia with a quiet fury that scared even him. But Patricia only smirked and said, "Don't give me that look. Counselor, I know how to play by the rules better than you think," before striding away as if she had won some twisted victory. That night, Sophia cried herself to sleep in Daniel's arms, whispering that maybe they should move, that maybe she didn't belong there, and Daniel felt something inside him fracture because no parent should ever have to see their child doubt her own worth, especially not because of a woman who saw cruelty as sport. And though he tried to reassure Sophia, tried to promise her that things would get better, he knew deep down that Patricia wasn't finished. This was just the beginning, the first strike of hatred. And like a storm gathering at sea, her malice was building momentum, preparing to break in a wave so violent that it would change their lives forever. Michael had always prided himself on keeping a calm head no matter the storm, but nothing in his years as both a father and a lawyer could have prepared him for the nightmare that unfolded on an otherwise ordinary afternoon when his daughter Grace, 10 years old, sweet-natured, wheelchair-bound, and the light of his world, became the target of the kind of brutality he had only ever seen in case files and criminal reports, brutality that would leave scars neither of them would ever forget. It started with a scream, high-pitched and sharp, the kind that shreds the air, and Michael, who had been reviewing briefs in his home office, bolted upright, his heart pounding as he recognized the voice. It was Grace, and it was the sound of raw terror. He ran outside, papers scattering behind him, and what he saw made his blood run cold. His little girl sitting helplessly in her wheelchair at the edge of their driveway, her hands raised in desperate defense, while Linda, the HOA enforcer, whose name carried venom in every whispered conversation, stood above her clutching a jagged brick in both hands, her face twisted in a mask of unhinged fury. "You think you can ruin my neighborhood? You think you belong here?" Linda shrieked, and before Michael could reach them, before his legs could carry him across the few steps of concrete fast enough, the brick came crashing down, smashing against Grace's cheek with a sickening crack that echoed like thunder through the cul-de-sac, and the world seemed to slow as blood spattered across the pale cement, her cry torn from her throat, half scream, half choke, the sound that would haunt Michael forever. Neighbors' doors flew open, curtains were pulled back, gasps filled the air, but not one person moved to intervene as Grace slumped sideways in her chair, her tiny hands clutching her face, her stuffed bunny tumbling to the ground where its fur quickly stained red. Michael lunged forward, shoving Linda back with a strength fueled by sheer panic, his arm scooping Grace from her chair, his hands already slick with her blood, his mind spinning between rage and terror as he shouted her name over and over. "Grace! Grace, stay with me, sweetheart!" But her eyes fluttered weakly, the swelling already forming across her delicate features, her breath shallow and ragged. Linda, staggered but not repentant, stumbled back and spat. She had it coming, filthy little liability. "This is my neighborhood." And though Michael wanted nothing more than to tear her apart with his bare hands, his daughter's whimper anchored him, reminding him that saving her life came first. "Call 911, he screamed at the gawking neighbors, his voice cracking like a whip, but the silence was deafening, the paralysis of a community too cowardly or complicit to move, until finally someone muttered, "I think someone already did." Though Michael knew seconds were precious, and he couldn't wait for bureaucracy to move, he sprinted to his car, cradling Grace against his chest, her blood soaking through his shirt, whispering broken promises, "You'll be okay. Baby, Daddy's here, I won't let you go," as his tears blurred the road ahead. The drive to the hospital was a blur of red lights he ignored, horns that blared as he tore through intersections, every heartbeat screaming that if he slowed, if he hesitated, he might lose her forever. At the ER, chaos erupted as nurses rushed forward, pulling Grace from his arms onto a gurney, voices barking medical jargon, the bright lights reflecting off the streaks of blood across her tiny face, and Michael, trembling, tried to follow but was held back by a firm hand on his chest. "Sir, let us work. You need to wait here." And in that sterile hallway that smelled of antiseptic and dread, Michael sank to his knees, his fists pounding against the tile, his lawyer's mind useless in the face of his daughter's suffering, every rational thought. Drowned by the echo of that brick-hitting flesh, hours stretched like days until a surgeon finally emerged, his mask pulled down, his eyes weary as he explained that Grace had suffered multiple fractures, a concussion, and deep lacerations that required stitches, but she was alive, for now. Relief hit Michael like a tidal wave, but it was quickly followed by the molten rage of a father who knew justice had to be served, not someday, not eventually, but now, because no one, no court, no law, no system would ever feel the depth of what he had just witnessed. When he returned home that night, his shirt stiff with dried blood, the driveway was still stained where Grace's screams had first split the air, the stuffed bunny still lying abandoned under the porch light, and Linda's house sat in mocking silence across the street, her blinds drawn tight, as if hiding from the storm she had unleashed. Michael picked up the bunny with shaking hands, holding it to his chest like a relic, and in that moment he swore. Not as a lawyer, not as a man of reason, but as a father, that Linda had declared war, and he would fight her with everything he had, no matter what it cost, because she thought she had broken them with a brick, but she had only awakened something far stronger, a resolve sharper than steel, fueled by love and fury, and it would not rest until she paid for what she had done. Anthony sat in the cold hospital corridor with his head buried in his blood-stained hands, his suit jacket crumpled at his side, while doctors and nurses rushed in and out of Lily's room, their voices muffled behind swinging doors, and every tick of the clock above him felt like a hammer against his chest. He had spent his career inside courtrooms where logic and evidence held sway, but in this moment he was nothing but a father stripped raw, terrified that the next person to walk through those doors would tell him his daughter hadn't made it. And when finally a nurse stepped out with tired eyes and said, "She's stable for now, but it's critical you prepare yourself. Her recovery will be long, and there may be permanent damage," Anthony nearly collapsed from the mixture of relief and despair flooding his veins. He forced himself into the room, where Lily lay beneath a tangle of wires and machines, her face swollen, stitches jagged against her fragile skin, one eye bandaged, and her tiny hand barely strong enough to grip his fingers when he whispered, "Daddy's here, I'll never leave you." But even in her dazed state, she managed to whimper, "It hurts," and he felt his world tilt on its axis, rage bubbling just beneath the surface, demanding release. But before he could even begin processing his own grief, reality came crashing in. The police showed up, not with handcuffs for Cheryl, but with questions that dripped suspicion toward him and his daughter, one officer clearing his throat as he said, "The suspect claims she was defending herself, that the child tried to strike her first with an object," words so absurd Anthony almost laughed. But the sound that left his throat was closer to a snarl. "She's 10 years old, wheelchair-bound, and you're telling me a grown woman needed to smash her in the face with a brick to protect herself?" Yet the officers scribbled in their notepads, avoiding his burning gaze, clearly under the sway of Cheryl's carefully rehearsed lies. It got worse. By the time Anthony returned home to grab clean clothes, he found flyers stuffed in his mailbox, printed by the HOA, suggesting that certain residents were endangering the community with false accusations and disruptive behavior. Thinly veiled words that painted him and Lily as the problem, not Cheryl. And as he ripped the paper in his fists, he saw neighbors standing on their porches whispering, some shaking their heads with pity, others with irritation, but none with support. Cheryl herself had already begun her campaign, standing smugly in her driveway, giving statements to a cluster of curious residents, claiming that Lily had thrown something at her flowers, that she had acted instinctively, that she regretted how badly things turned out, but insisted she was the real victim of harassment by a father who couldn't control his disabled child. Anthony's hands shook as he watched her performance, every word a dagger twisting deeper, and though he wanted to march across the street and tear down her lies with the truth, he knew the trap. She wanted him angry, irrational, so she could point and say, "See, he's unstable." So he swallowed his fury, clutching the memory of Lily's bloodied face as fuel for what was coming. But even the justice system he trusted seemed determined to fail him. When he pressed the local DA about charges, he was told the evidence was complicated, that eyewitnesses gave conflicting accounts, which only enraged Anthony further, because he knew those eyewitnesses were the same neighbors who had stood frozen, unwilling to intervene, now too cowardly to admit what they had seen. Each night at the hospital, Anthony whispered promises into Lily's ear, telling her that her pain would not be in vain, that he would make Cheryl pay. But every day he returned home to find fresh insults. His mailbox smashed, threatening notes slipped under his door, graffiti scrawled on his fence that read, "Leave freaks out." It was no longer just Cheryl's war, but the community's silent complicity, and it carved into Anthony a deeper wound than he thought possible. Because it wasn't just one woman who had tried to destroy his daughter. It was an entire neighborhood too cowardly, too cruel, or too indifferent to stop her. Yet beneath the crushing weight of despair, something inside Anthony hardened, a steel resolve sharpening into a blade. He had spent years using the law to defend strangers, but now he would wield it like a weapon for his daughter, and Cheryl, smug in her delusions of untouchable power, had no idea that she had awakened not just a father's fury, but a lawyer's relentless pursuit. And Anthony swore in that dimly lit hospital room, clutching Lily's frail hand as machines beeped steadily beside her, that he would not stop, he would not rest, he would not even breathe freely until Cheryl's lies crumbled in a courtroom and the world saw her for what she truly was, a monster hiding behind HOA rules and suburban smiles. David had always known the law could be a slow, grinding machine, but now that his daughter Anna's broken face was burned into his memory, he refused to let that machine crush him the way Brenda, the tyrant of their neighborhood, had intended. Every moment he spent watching Anna struggle through the pain of her injuries, her jaw wired shut, her eye darkened and swollen, her tiny hands trembling when she tried to hold a spoon, hardened his resolve to fight back, not as a grieving father begging for pity, but as a lawyer who understood every angle, every loophole, every crack in the facade Brenda was trying so desperately to maintain. While she paraded around the subdivision, planting flowers and gossiping about how tragic misunderstandings could spiral out of control, David was quietly turning his grief into strategy, setting up cameras around his property, recording every interaction, gathering every shred of evidence that could paint the truth she wanted to bury. He knew Brenda's type. People who thrived on intimidation, who relied on silence and complicity. And he also knew that bullies like her always slipped up when they thought no one was watching, and sure enough, within days he caught her on video shouting slurs at Anna from across the street, her voice dripping with venom as she hissed, "You don't belong here, cripple," words that on their own might have been dismissed as cruel, but not criminal, yet in the broader context of her violent attack, they became invaluable proof of motive and malice. David began building his case piece by piece, interviewing the few neighbors who still had a conscience, persuading them with the calm certainty of a lawyer that their silence would make them complicit, and slowly he pulled reluctant testimonies out of them, shaky voices admitting they had seen Brenda holding the brick, that they had heard the sickening impact, that they had watched Anna scream. But Brenda wasn't oblivious to his efforts. She escalated, retaliating in ways designed to rattle him, slashing his car tires in the dead of night, sending anonymous notes with crude drawings of wheelchairs set on fire, even once leaving a dead bird on his porch as if to remind him that he was prey at her eyes. Anna grew more frightened each day, waking up from nightmares in the hospital and asking, "Daddy, will she hurt me again?" And David, forcing strength into his voice, would answer, "Not if I can help it, baby." Though inside he knew Brenda's arrogance made her unpredictable and dangerous. When the police dragged their feet, citing insufficient evidence, David filed motions himself, drafting documents late into the night, his office cluttered with stacks of affidavits, medical reports, and photographs of Anna's injuries, every page a silent scream for justice. He wasn't just reacting anymore, he was preparing for war, and he wanted Brenda blindsided. Then came the HOA meeting that turned into a battlefield. Brenda stood at the head of the table, smirking in her pastel cardigan, spinning her lies about being harassed, about fearing for her safety, and David let her speak, let her dig her own grave, before standing and methodically dismantling her with facts, reading aloud Anna's hospital chart, citing HOA bylaws she herself had violated, and finally playing a recording on his phone of Brenda's slurs, the room falling into stunned silence as her own voice filled the air, Brenda's face flushed, her mouth opening and closing like a fish, but before she could regroup, David leaned across the table and said in a voice low and lethal, "You think this is bad? Wait until the courtroom." And for the first time, he saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. Yet even as he gained ground, he knew the battle was far from over. Brenda's hatred didn't stop at public humiliation, it only sharpened, and within days his mailbox was set on fire, scorch marks blackening the white wood, and he found himself standing in the driveway at 3 a.m, clutching a baseball bat, his eyes scanning the shadows because he knew she was out there, watching, waiting for her chance to strike again. But instead of breaking him, every attack only strengthened his resolve. Every threat only sharpened his strategy because David had made a vow beside Anna's hospital bed, a vow sealed with the memory of her bloodied face. He would not just survive Brenda's war, he would end it, and when the gavel finally fell, she would learn what it truly meant to underestimate a lawyer and worse, a father. The courtroom that morning was suffocating with tension, the kind you could feel pressing against your chest and stealing the air from your lungs. As I sat beside my daughter Emily, her fragile frame wrapped in a soft blue sweater that contrasted sharply against the ugly bruises fading across her face, the ones Karen had inflicted with a brick. The sight alone had jurors shifting uncomfortably in their seats. But Karen sat there smugly at the defendant's table, her pearl necklace gleaming, her lips curled into the faintest smirk as though she had already won. And that arrogance burned inside me like gasoline poured on open flames. But I forced myself to stay calm, because I knew the law, I knew the process, and more importantly, I knew that justice had to be fought for with precision, not rage, though deep down all I wanted was to scream at the top of my lungs and demand that everyone see the monster sitting across from us for who she really was. The prosecution began its opening arguments, laying out the attack in clear, brutal detail, and the jury flinched when photographs of Emily's swollen, battered face were displayed on the projector screen. But Karen never blinked, never broke that mask of superiority, even whispering to her lawyer and laughing softly, and the sight made Emily clutch my hand tighter, her small fingers trembling, and I leaned down and whispered, "It's going to be okay, sweetheart. I promise you," though my heart was pounding so violently that I wondered if it might give me away, because this wasn't just about the law anymore. This was about showing the entire neighborhood, the entire court, and Karen herself that no one could brutalize a disabled child and walk away untouched. When it was the defense's turn, Karen's lawyer painted Emily as a troublesome child, someone who had supposedly provoked Karen by trespassing and throwing things at her flowers, and the bile rose in my throat at the audacity of such a twisted lie. But Karen nodded along as if every word were gospel. And it was then that I realized their entire strategy was to tarnish Emily's innocence, to make her appear like some kind of aggressor despite the obvious fact that she couldn't even walk without assistance. And when Emily's wheelchair was rolled into view for the jury to see, I caught more than one juror shaking their heads in disbelief at the defense's cruelty, but Karen just crossed her arms, her chin lifted in defiance. When the first witness, a neighbor named Linda, took the stand, she described hearing the screams, the sound of something heavy striking, and then rushing out to see Karen standing over Emily with the brick still in her hand, her face twisted in anger. And though Karen's lawyer tried to rattle Linda by suggesting she didn't see the full context, Linda's voice never faltered as she pointed directly at Karen and said, "I saw what I saw, and I will never forget it," sending a wave of murmurs across the courtroom. Still, the defense tried to chip away at every testimony, every photo, every piece of evidence, but I had anticipated their moves, and as my turn to speak drew closer, I rehearsed every word in my head, every fact and law that could cut through their smokescreen like a blade, because this wasn't just about winning, it was about dismantling Karen's mask in front of everyone. When I was finally called to the stand, I steadied myself, locking eyes with the jury, speaking not just as a father, but as a lawyer, explaining in plain words how Karen's actions fit every legal definition of aggravated assault, how Emily's rights had been trampled upon, how the evidence was undeniable. And as I spoke, I saw some of the jurors lean in closer, listening, connecting with the raw emotion behind my words, because I wasn't just presenting facts. I was showing them the heartbreak, the fear, the injustice of a child's face being shattered by a neighbor's hatred. Karen shifted uncomfortably for the first time then, her smirk faltering as she realized that my voice wasn't just for the court, it was for Emily, it was for every parent watching, it was for justice itself. And as I finished, I glanced at my daughter, her eyes shining with tears, and I swore I saw hope flicker inside her again. But then Karen made her move, demanding to take the stand, her arrogance pushing her into a dangerous corner, and when she sat down, she began weaving a story about being harassed for years by our family, claiming Emily's cries were manipulative and that she had acted in self-defense, and the sheer venom in her words had me gripping the edge of the table until my knuckles whitened, because hearing my daughter painted as some kind of malicious mastermind was almost too much to bear. But I forced myself to watch as Karen dug her own grave, her anger boiling over, her voice rising until even the judge had to warn her to compose herself. The jury's faces told me everything I needed to know. They weren't buying it, they were disgusted, they were beginning to see the truth. And I knew then that the final blow was coming, because tomorrow I would reveal the secret weapon I had held back, the one piece of evidence Karen didn't know I had, the one that would destroy her defense completely and expose her for the violent predator she was. And as court adjourned for the day, Karen strutted past us, whispering under her breath, "You'll regret this," her eyes burning with hatred, but I only held Emily tighter, whispering back to her, "She doesn't know what's coming, sweetheart. She has no idea." The final day of the trial dawned heavy with anticipation, the kind of electric stillness that makes the hairs on the back of your neck rise, and as Emily and I entered the courtroom, I could feel every eye following us, the jury tense and expectant, the spectators whispering about what would happen next, and Karen seated at the defense table with her chin high and her lips curved into that same infuriating smirk, as though she had weathered the storm and still believed she would walk away, untouched. But I had been waiting for this moment, holding back the one piece of evidence that would shatter her lies, And as the prosecution gave me the floor for rebuttal, I rose slowly, clutching the small USB drive in my hand like it was a weapon, my heart thundering as I turned to the jury and said, "You've heard the testimonies, you've seen the photos, you've witnessed the damage done. But today, you will hear Karen's own voice, in her own words, admitting what she did, and the courtroom went utterly silent, the defense visibly stiffening, Karen paling for just a moment before her lawyer leaned in to whisper frantically, but it was too late because I had already handed the drive to the clerk, who loaded the audio recording onto the system, and the room was filled with the chilling sound of Karen's voice, captured by a neighbor's outdoor security system the very night of the attack, her words venomous, unfiltered. "If that little cripple doesn't shut up, I'll smash her face with this brick, so she learns," followed by the sickening thud of impact and Emily's terrified scream. The gasps that erupted from the gallery were like waves crashing, jurors recoiling in horror. Even the judge's eyes narrowing as the recording continued, Karen muttering, "That'll teach her not to mess with me," before storming off, and I turned slowly to watch Karen's face crumble for the first time, her smirk gone, her eyes wide and frantic, as though she had been stripped bare, exposed for the monster she was. Her lawyer tried to object, stammering about authenticity and context, but the prosecution had already confirmed the file's chain of custody, the neighbor who had supplied it sitting in the gallery ready to testify, and I knew at that moment Karen was finished, her arrogance collapsing under the weight of her own words. The jury looked disgusted, shaken, some even glaring openly at Karen, and as the judge banged the gavel for order, I felt Emily squeeze my hand with trembling strength, her tears falling freely now, but not from fear, from relief, because finally the world was seeing the truth. Closing arguments followed, the prosecution's voice sharp with righteous fury as they reminded the jury that this was not an accident, not a misunderstanding, but a deliberate, hate-filled attack on a vulnerable child, an attack Karen had even boasted about in the heat of her cruelty, while the defense fumbled, their words hollow, their case obliterated, and as the jury was dismissed to deliberate, Karen sat rigid, her face drained of color, her earlier smugness replaced by raw panic, though every so often she would glance at me with eyes that burned with hatred, as if she still believed she could intimidate me. But I only met her stare with calm certainty because I knew what was coming. The deliberation took less than an hour, a clear sign, and when the jury filed back in, their expressions told the entire story before the foreperson even spoke. We, the jury, find the defendant, Karen Whitmore, guilty on all counts, and the eruption of noise in the courtroom drowned out the rest. People cheering, some crying, the judge banging the gavel to restore order. But all I could do was wrap my arms around Emily as she sobbed against my chest, whispering, "We did it, sweetheart, we did it." And for the first time since that horrible night, I felt the crushing weight begin to lift. The judge sentenced Karen swiftly, 10 years without parole, the maximum for a crime, and as deputies moved to cuff her, Karen fought, screaming obscenities, her voice shrill as she spat. "This isn't over. You'll pay for this. Both of you will pay." But her words fell on deaf ears because the world had finally seen who she was, and no amount of venom could undo the justice delivered that day. When it was over, Emily and I walked out into the sunlight, the air cool and fresh, and though her face still bore faint traces of the attack, her smile was brighter than I had ever seen, a fragile but determined light that told me she believed in herself again, believed that she was safe, believed that even in the darkest of battles, hope could survive. As we drove home, she leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "Dad, does this mean she can't hurt me anymore?" And I swallowed hard, kissing the top of her hair before answering, "That's exactly what it means, baby girl. She'll never hurt you again." Though in my heart I knew the scars, both seen and unseen, would take time to heal, but at least now, Emily could begin that journey without the shadow of Karen looming over her. In the weeks that followed, neighbors who had once remained silent came forward to apologize, to thank us for standing up, to admit that they too had been bullied by Karen but had been too afraid to speak, and as Emily grew stronger, her resilience inspired not just me, but the entire community, her laughter returning slowly, her courage shining through even when the nightmares woke her at night, because she knew now that she was not helpless, not voiceless, and never alone. And as for me, I realized that being a lawyer, wasn't just about statutes and codes, it was about using knowledge as a shield, a sword, and a voice for those who couldn't fight for themselves, especially for the daughter I would protect with every breath in my body. And so, as the sun set one evening while Emily and I sat on the porch, her wheelchair beside her and her eyes fixed on the horizon, she whispered, "Dad, I think Mom would be proud of us." And though tears blurred my vision, I nodded, smiling through the ache in my chest, because she was right. And in that moment, I knew we had not only won justice in court, we had reclaimed our peace, our dignity, and our hope for the future, leaving Karen and her brick behind us forever as nothing more than a warning of what hate could do, and a reminder of the unbreakable bond between a father and his daughter.